These magnificent bowls can be seen at the Swedish History Museum. They're made from paper-thin gold, serve no practical purpose, but are richly decorated and likely signified great status. They belong to an age when wealth and power concentrated like never before. So in this video, we're having a look at what it meant to be rich in the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age was an era of lavish gifts. Offerings of precious jewels and weapons have been preserved in places like bogs and springs, likely regarded as sacred. These objects might have disappeared from human ownership, but the people who offered them likely gained great honor in return. It was the expression of a ruling class that controlled access to gold and bronze, an elite buried with rich grave goods in majestic burial mounds. The Bronze Age came late to Scandinavia. It makes its start in the north in about 1700 BC, so that would be a millennium later after its beginning in the Aegean around 3000 BC. And it also continues until later, about 500 BC. Quite obviously, bronze defines the period, but its acquisition actually began much earlier. We have copper access and jewelry already present in the early Neolithic, in southern Scandinavia at least. The Bronze Age would have been a spectacular time in Northern Europe. There are more bronze artifacts in Scandinavia from this period than anywhere else on the continent, and from an archaeological perspective, pottery fades in comparison to bronze objects. Ceramics remain largely undecorated, and they rarely appear outside of households or grave contexts. That metal production and crafts blossomed with the onset of the Bronze Age is suggested by the very large number of fragments of crucibles and casting molds for the production of metal tools, weapons, and jewelry in the Bronze Age workshops, primarily on settlement sites across the southern half of Scandinavia. But we also have imported ingots of tin and copper, and the products of the casting process, the artifacts themselves, they come primarily from graves and treasure hoards. While there are some areas of copper ore in middle Sweden and southern Norway, they don't really seem to have been exploited during the Bronze Age. Many locally manufactured bronze objects, such as the lurs, the large trumpet-like instruments, and shields, are absolutely astonishing, and they have been found largely intact in hoards and graves. And it seems like the ore used for these items was imported, but the items themselves were often locally manufactured. By the middle of the second millennium BC, Northern and Western Europe witnessed a number of major innovations. Not only weapons, but also stuff like secondary animal products, like wool and milk, became more important and fostered new industries. Horses also became more common in this period, probably with the introduction of the chariot, or as draft animals in military contexts. So these changes accumulated in larger and more powerful societies where trade, craft production, and growing competition for resources were added on top of the layer of agricultural production. At the same time, the Bronze Age witnessed the first pronounced differences in social status and position in Northern European societies. There was this acute competition that eventually led to more warfare that was cross-cutting the ties of exchange and trade. And the metals that defined the period provided the weapons necessary for the class of the warrior elite that was constantly seeking power and control. Wealth differences probably associated with the ownership of land and cattle herds were a significant aspect of life in that period. Also, slaves and captives likely were involved in the economic activities of wealthier families. Furthermore, the control of amber sources around southern Scandinavia provided an exportable wealth in the region, perhaps in conjunction with other commodities such as furs. One aspect of the Nordic Bronze Age that has contributed to its remarkable archaeology are the massive burial mounds that dot the landscape of southern Scandinavia and parts of middle Sweden and southern Norway. Some of these barrows have extraordinary conditions of preservation for stuff like furniture, clothing, and even some of the hairstyles of the Bronze Age. Differences in social status are displayed in the riches buried in stone cists and oak coffins during the early Bronze Age. In the late Bronze Age, cremation and the placement of the ashes in urns become the predominant form of burial practice. And these two customs largely reflect the situation in Central Europe as well. For example, in the Urnfield culture from around 1300 BC. This custom might have concealed a reality of considerable social inequality as well, because we have chieftains' burials below giant tumuli, for example, in the site of Lusehøj in southwestern Fyn in Denmark. After 1500 BC, weapons graves began to appear across Central and Northern Europe, and weaponry took the form of swords, spearheads, axes, and some sort of defensive equipment as well. But the graves also contained stuff like combs, razors, tweezers, or even mirrors. So, as a warrior, it was apparently expected from you to be well groomed as well. This identity, as you can probably imagine, was, however, limited to the upper echelons of Bronze Age society. The sword was the first equipment designed specifically for combat, not simply adapted from hunting gear. Swords were primarily designed for hand to hand combat, slashing, and they were deadly. Of course, the weapons also functioned as important status symbols, and they must have been of great value. They were frequently resharpened and had nicks removed before being placed in a burial, for example. Furthermore, swords in votive weapons offerings were usually not repaired, so in a sense, the scars of battle should have been preserved as well. Until quite recently, there was actually little evidence of large scale violence in the Bronze Age in Northern Europe. However, discoveries such as that in the Tollensee Valley in northern Germany are changing the view. Here, beginning with the 80s, a series of finds were made along the banks and in the river itself, including bronze weapons and jewelry, as well as a number of animal and human bones. Most of the individuals were male between 20 and 40 years of age. Among the male remains, there were at least 8 lethal blows seen in the crania, alongside a flint arrowhead in a shoulder joint. Radiocarbon dates from the human bones fall very close together at about 1200 BC, and this suggests that the bodies at the Tollensee Valley might have resulted from one single event. So, such evidence implies a very violent battle that took place in the early Bronze Age. So, what makes the Bronze Age so special? Well, broadly speaking, the development of inequality. And this marks a fundamental shift from a relatively egalitarian social structure in the Neolithic to a hierarchically organized society. So the period established the warrior chieftaincy system, where wealth and status were more formalized and accumulated in the hands of a very rich ruling elite. One primary manifestation of elite power during the Bronze Age was the hoarding and deliberate destruction of valuable goods. And this served both economic and ritual functions, because you were basically removing wealth from circulation and demonstrating profound authority at the same time. I'm going to exemplify with the Fröslunda hoard. This dates back to the late Bronze Age, so about 700 to 900 BC. This is a clear example of the elite's ability to expend vast resources on items specifically intended for ritual and status, which were afterwards removed from circulation by deposition. The hoard consisted of at least 16 thin hammered bronze shields that were intentionally placed somewhere in a bog in middle Sweden, and the offerings were layered with woven reed mats placed between them, suggesting a ceremonial arrangement, a careful one. These shields were typically non functional. They're made of metal less than 1 millimeter thick and likely served as items for ceremony or status display rather than defensive weapons. And they show the ability of the elite to command the production of non essential but valuable metal items that serve this purpose of ritual use. And then the ultimate destruction was a display of control over resources. The act of hoarding precious metal functioned to increase their scarcity and thus the value of the remaining metal supply circulating in society. Another example would be the Stockhult hoard. This was found next to a large cup-marked stone in southeastern Skåne in the early Bronze Age, so that would be about 15 to 1400 BC. And it seems to have combined valuable metal objects with religious iconography. And yeah, this would have largely been a mirror to the ideological power of the ruling elite. The cache included bronze items associated with status. We have axes, a spearhead, jewelry like necklaces, bracelets, and so on. Critically, the hoard also contained two very interesting small bronze human figurines. The bronze figurines were interpreted as effigies of sun gods, potentially representing the divine twins, which seem to have been central to early Indo European beliefs, or some similar mythological figure. At any rate, the act of burying very valuable items of material wealth alongside figures likely representing some sort of divinity meant the elites were trying to not only monopolize high status trade goods, but also control powerful religious symbols and rituals in society. We have a deposition at a sacred ceremonial site suggested by this cup marked stone, and this meant that the elites were really trying to publicly link their group to divine authority. And then we have the burial mounds. The monumental tombs of the Bronze Age, is typically massive earthen barrows or rock cairns. They were the most visible expression of power and wealth in the Bronze Age, and they required an extraordinary effort to construct. For example, this one here at Bredarer in Sweden. It is one of the largest burial mounds in Northern Europe, and it is an enormous rock cairn. It measures no fewer than 75 meters in diameter. It's very interesting because it contains a large stone cyst decorated with rock art, petroglyphs, and these depict people, ships, animals, bronze horns, and some sort of chariot or cart, and it dates back to about 1500 BC. So a lot of religious and political symbols to be seen here. Divahoy in Denmark is also a large earthen barrow constructed in several stages. The mount originally stood 5 meters high and was approximately 25 meters in diameter. Now, you can imagine that constructing such large and round earthen barrows required removing the topsoil and sod from very large areas, up to 10 hectares of land, to actually create the mound. The barrow contained an elaborate grave for an elite individual. It incorporated a core of clay that intentionally waterlogged the burial, leading to an excellent preservation of materials in the oak coffin inside the mound. The location of the entire structure is also very telling because it lay over an early Neolithic settlement. So this suggests that the elites at the time, they were also trying to create a link to ancestry, to some sort of very, very old land that they now claimed as their own. Borum Esroy, located near Aarhus, is also interesting. The original mound was approximately 9 meters high, 40 meters in diameter, and it contained 3 oak coffins holding the bodies of an older man, an older woman, and a young man, probably their son, all buried around 1350 BC. The preservation was exceptional here as well, leaving the hair and fine woolen clothing of the deceased largely intact. The construction of the tomb, like many other large barrows, was undertaken during a brief period of time, involved an immense effort, communal labor, and all was done to commemorate the high rank of the interred. However, such events would have had a deep impact on the communities themselves, helping them come together because of this massive effort and because of all the labor and emotion involved in it. So, in other words, it helped to create an identity for the group taking part in such an undertaking. When talking about the accumulation of wealth and power, one concept that is often used to describe this process in the Nordic Bronze Age is that of maritime mode of production. So, this means essentially political strategies aimed at controlling both trading and raiding. And this was achieved through the elite ownership of vessels and the financing of long distance maritime expeditions. Sounds a bit like the Viking Age, doesn't it? A core objective was to actively seek out the sources of prestige goods, particularly metals like copper and tin, which were not really available in Scandinavia. So, by navigating directly to the source, maritime groups could bypass expensive middlemen, lower transaction costs, and avoid potentially hostile encounters in intermediate zones. The development of the maritime mode of production was synonymous with the formation of new maritime institutions that were necessary to enter and maintain international networks and alliances, introducing this sort of pan European warriorhood with its specific code of communication and ideological symbols. Its success was linked to advanced boat building technology, specifically the development of plank built vessels, the predecessors of the yacht springboat. These ships were extraordinary because they were capable of withstanding the open waters of the Skagerrak, for example, and they required crews with sophisticated maritime skills and seafaring. The ships also served as a collective and unifying feature in this mode of production, turning individuals into a disciplined crew capable of carrying out commercial, ritual, competitive tasks, so essentially shaping the identity of the warrior, trader, and explorer, thus paving the way for the Viking Age centuries later. We can think of it a little bit like a vertical trade corporation of the ancient world, in the sense that rather than waiting for goods to pass through a long chain of independent sellers, the ruling elite decided that it was the best solution to build their own shipping fleets and to send them directly to the source, in this case, the metal mines. And in this way, to ensure they controlled every stage of the process and thus keep the maximum profit and power to themselves. If you're interested in the topic, I also made a video about seafaring in the Bronze Age, and I think it would broaden the picture quite a bit. Or perhaps you prefer burial mounds. In this case, I'd recommend a material about a site called Arnöshög in Sweden. Anyway, thank you so much for following this channel, and if you want to support it more actively, consider a membership either here on YouTube or on Patreon. Here on YouTube, you do get bonus lectures, and on Patreon, you receive ad-free videos. This was Irina, thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.